Okay, so hello. My name is Conrad von Scharnhorst. You may know me from my other main channel. I am actually a military historian, going to college and university to be that, and basically I'm almost finished. And I thought I would do a reaction for different videos on historical topics that, a military historian might have more insight on, okay? I am not trying to be like a regular quote unquote reactor that's just going to sit here and react. I'm going to actually add some historical details if I can, if I know anything on the subject, and use any of that stuff. So if you like that stuff, man. Also, this is my face, so yeah, congratulations, you see my face now. Okay, cool. So we're gonna react to the Fallen of World War II. This video came out in 2016. Links in the description. Go check it out. Leave a like there. Otherwise, I'm gonna play the video. You're gonna see my reaction. So let's get to this bread.
The average lifespan of an American is 80 years. And an 80-year-old today was 10 when World War II ended, 4 when it began. A soldier who saw battle would have to be in his late 80s at least today. Generals, political leaders, the decision makers of the war, few are still with us. And over the past few decades, we've seen authors and filmmakers rush to capture stories from survivors.
I'll add to this. This was made in 2016, right? It's now 2022. There's not a lot of veterans that are actually left for us to interview, which is very sad, right? We've passed the threshold on World War One already, and we've almost completely reached that point in World War II. So if you still have any of them around, there are few around still, but they are very few and far between. Unlike 20 years ago, there was a lot more around, but now we just don't have them anymore, which is sad.
Before this connection of memory is lost. This project is not about individual war stories, and it's not about survivors. We're going to tally up the tens of millions of people whose lives were cut short by the war, and see how these numbers stack up to other wars in history, including trends in recent conflicts.
Now, I know based off the fact World War II, it did have a lot of casualties, and it had a lot more casualties per population than World War One. But World War One for different countries was a lot more devastating than World War II was. Okay, it's just different percentages wise. So more deaths in World War II overall. It was a bigger conflict than World War One. So there is that.
We'll be counting soldiers and civilians separately. Each of these figures represents 1,000 people who died. Civilians were of all walks of life, whereas military deaths were almost entirely men. The average age was about 23. In most battles, for every 1,000 soldiers killed, there are more than 1,000 who were injured. The word casualty can be confusing because in military speak, it often includes both deaths and injuries, and anything else that takes a soldier out of service. Here, we're just counting the deaths.
Okay, that's very important to remember. He's just counting the deaths here. The casualty numbers are a lot higher than, I'm assuming, what he's going to draw out, okay? Because casualties can mean a whole bunch of stuff. Casualties can mean disabling injuries, and casualties can mean you're out for a week and have to go back to the field. It varies wildly, depending on what the injury was.
And we'll begin with American soldiers. Over 400,000 died. Most of the deaths occurred in the European theater, fighting the Nazis. And about a quarter were in the Pacific.
So I pause it there. So we lost 400,000 soldiers in the United States, right? I already know, just off the top of my head, that is nowhere near any other country, basically in World War II, maybe besides the British and the Canadians. But that is important to remember. We lost 400,000 people here. Our casualty rate was very low for a combatant in World War II. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. And I might get into them depending on what he says here, but just 400,000 deaths for the United States is a lot. It is if I'm not mistaken, that is more than we took in World War One. I'm almost positive of that. maybe the influenza did kill more in total, but just the deaths from military deaths alone was catastrophic, or not catastrophic, but it leaves an impact even today.
Fighting the Japanese. When you put them on the timeline, you see that casualties were the heaviest at the end of the war. The war began on September 1st, 1939. But the US wasn't willing to join the fight until Pearl Harbor, 2 years in. The deaths increased drastically on D-Day, when the Allies invaded Normandy.
Pause here, okay? I want to back it up even slightly. So, most kids in the United States, okay? This is a generalization, but I've been through the system, so I should know. I took AP classes in high school, right? And we learned very generally about world history, because even for U.S. history, it's very skimmed over. There is almost nothing talked about before Pearl Harbor. There was an entire whole war going on before the United States joined, but most Americans and even most high schoolers, unless you actively go seek out that information, you don't learn it. You don't learn about Poland, you don't learn about France, you don't learn about Britain, right? Everything after 1941, December 7th, to the end of the war, you learn very generally. It's kind of a messed up thing, but hey, it's the way it is.
The deaths increased drastically on D-Day, when the Allies invaded Normandy. One of the most tragic moments of the war was on D-Day at Omaha Beach, where 2,500 Americans fell. So about the same number of US soldiers died on this single beach landing as the entire 13 years of the recent war in Afghanistan.
That's important to remember, because that war has now ended. That ended in 2021. We all have varying opinions on how that ended. But that casualty rate is around what it was at 2,500. It's probably what it was for Afghanistan. It may have gone up a little bit since the video was made in 2016. We also have to talk about, since the beach landings, again, Americans know 2 beaches, Omaha, Utah, okay? We talk about those. We know about those, okay? But we don't talk about Point Du Hoc, okay? We don't talk about June, Sword, or Gold Beach, okay? And I can't raise my other hand. But we don't talk about any of the other beaches, right? We don't talk about the British, the French, the Canadians, right? We don't even talk about the invasion of South France, okay? That the operation name escapes me. I believe it was Operation Husky. I'm pretty sure I'm wrong there. But hey, the invasion of South France. We don't learn anything about that, and that was a very crucial aspect to D-Day after we pushed through the frontal beachhead and got an established perimeter. The second part, landing in South France, was vital so we could put more pressure on Germany. We never talk about that ever in any history class I've ever been a part of.
The bloodiest battle in the Pacific was Okinawa, which lasted 82 days, during which 12,500 Americans died.
12,500 Americans on Okinawa. Now, that is a very high percentage of Americans, especially Marines and Army personnel that were on that island, okay? That was one of the key factors into the reason of actually dropping the bomb, was the defense of Okinawa and Iwo Jima and how brutal the Japanese were fighting there, okay? That was the estimate figures they were using for actual Operation Downfall, which was the code name for we're going to invade Japan with a combined, this is important, a combined force of United States, Great Britain, Australia, and I believe Canadians too, and New Zealanders, okay? It was a combined effort, and other allies of that time were going to land on Japan in Operation Downfall, okay? The reason we didn't want to do that at all costs was because of Okinawa and Iwo Jima, and because we had the Manhattan Project to drop the bomb. Those were the main reasons why we dropped the bomb, okay?
About 5,000 of these deaths were at sea from kamikaze attacks.
Now, he mentions that very briefly, okay? The kamikaze attacks on Iwo Jima and Okinawa were out. They wrecked so many United States ships, actually just coalition force ships, okay? The Allied ships were wrecked from the kamikazes. We lost carriers. Bunker Hill was damaged, if not sunk, okay? And it was bad for basically everything. And USS Laffey was in Okinawa or Iwo Jima, or maybe a little bit after. I think survived like 28 planes coming in to try to kamikaze it, okay? and it was very effective because you can't stop a plane that's coming in on you. You shoot it down, you better blow off a wing because otherwise it's coming in at you. The Japanese also had rockets, but they were very seldomly used, at least in Okinawa and Iwo Jima. But it's important to remember these because that was another reason why we're like invading Japan and Operation Downfall would have been very bad.
Now let's look at some other countries, starting with Europe. Germany started World War II when it invaded Poland. Poland ultimately lost 200,000 soldiers in the war. Most died after the invasion.
Okay, I'm gonna pause it here. So the invasion of Poland in 1939, September 1st. Okay, the invasion suffered relatively little casualties. Because in post-invasion, I'm assuming he's talking about the Einsatzgruppen, the camps, everything past that. Okay, the actual invasion was very quick on Poland, and there was a variety of factors that led to that. Okay, so Poland didn't issue mobilization because they were told by their allies to not do that. Okay, Poland also annexed Zalier. It's a little part of Czechoslovakia. When Germany annexed the Sudetenland, and fully annexed Czechoslovakia, Poland invaded Zalier for the Polish ethnic group there, right? That was seen by the British and the French as antagonistic, and they didn't like Poland very much because of that. And again, France and Britain were trying to delay, trying to appease Hitler, and they didn't want Poland to mobilize, okay? The problem was Poland, but when they got invaded, they issued the mobilization orders a few days beforehand, and they were still trying to get troops in when the German army was steamrolling, okay, going across their country. They were putting up a decent defense. France France actually did their job, which supposedly, right? They pushed past the Maginot Line and met very little resistance, right? This is called Plan West for Poland to defend the western part of their country behind the river line. Okay, the river wasn't there because of drought, which led to poor defense, and France didn't do their job basically. France met little resistance, stopped, pushed back to Maginot. This World War II could have very well ended in maybe 2 years. Okay, maybe even a year if France did actually push with their army through, but they didn't. Poland fell. Okay, now that's saying Poland put up a hell of a fight on the Western Front. We don't ever talk about that in American class, but they put up a hell of a fight against the Germans. And then, as they were being pushed back, the Soviets declared war on them, and a lot of their guys tried to get out through the Romanian bridgehead, but not a lot made through. Okay, because Romania was actually favorable to Poland. Okay, so they let their troops get out, but only very few made it out of there.
Invasion while the country was occupied by Germany and the Soviet Union.
Okay, the Casualties massacre is the Soviets. If I remember correctly, it is only officers. Well, it was officers and probably enlisted guys. They were all shot in a forest and buried by the Soviets. The NKVD, I'm assuming, was responsible. We don't know about the miscaptivity and the Polish resistance. The Warsaw Uprising in 1944 that was basically the culmination of the resistance. But that's a whole different issue I could get into. But a lot of people died in that one.
Germany, meanwhile, lost just 16,000 in the invasion of Poland.
Now, that's important because 16,000 versus Poland, you can see that Germany didn't have as much tanks as they didn't have fully mechanized forces and motorized forces at the time, but they did have aircraft, they did have a very professional military, and they had a very quick punch, okay, that was able to overwhelm Poland, okay, and they had a lot of actual generals that were good at their job, okay. This all culminates with a lightning strike, quote-unquote, blitzkrieg against Poland that worked very well in their favor.
The Nazis went on to invade and conquer.
I'll pause here. Denmark fought for a few hours, if not a day. They surrendered. Belgium was overwhelmed and surrendered. The Netherlands fought on for a little while and surrendered when Germany said they're going to bomb Amsterdam. France fought as hard as they could, and they were outflanked. There's a lot of stuff that led to France falling, and I could get into that in a different topic video. But basically, it's not the average French soldier's problem, right? It wasn't their fault. They did a hell of a job defending their country. The same for Greece, and the same for Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was overwhelmed by pretty much everyone at the same time, and Greece actually pushed the Italians back.
other countries, including Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Greece, and Yugoslavia. France surrendered, but after losing 92,000 soldiers in the Battle of France. Over 200,000 ultimately fell, which includes deaths in POW camps, French colonies, and other fighting.
I wonder if he's referring to other fighting as in Vichy France, because that might be in Free France, because Free France continued to fight for the Allies, and Vichy France was on the opposite side. So France was, having basically a civil war at this point.
Yugoslavia suffered almost 500,000 military deaths. The initial invasion brought relatively few casualties on both sides.
This is important to remember. The invasion was quick, and they ousted the crown prince, if I'm not mistaken, maybe even being king. But the post-invasion was the resistance, okay, and it was the most effective resistance in Europe. The entirety of Europe, Yugoslavia was like the main resistance point. Yugoslavia basically liberated itself, if I can quote someone, right? Liberated themselves with Joseph Tito, okay? Their resistance was far more effective than the French resistance. We talk about the French resistance, we barely talk about the Yugoslavian resistance.
But the deaths mounted under Nazi occupation due to guerrilla fighting, civil conflict, and mass executions. The Nazi invasions were swift, with relatively few German losses. Even the Nazi commanders expressed surprise at their success. And then we have the United Kingdom and the United States, who were not invaded but took the fight to the Nazis. Britain lost about the same number of soldiers as the US.
And this is important. Britain, they said Britain here, lost the same amount of soldiers about as the US. Now, Britain has a much smaller population than the United States back then. So, as a percentage point, that's a lot higher. They've had a lot higher of a price.
Which includes the British colonies. Germany.
Okay, so if that's including British colonies too, I wonder how that's broken down. Because we have Canada, New Zealand, Australia, I have South Africa. Those are just the dominions. And then we have all the rest of it, okay? We have British Malaya, we have a lot that could be in there.
Germany lost about 500,000 soldiers fighting the US and Britain in what is known as the Western Front, which took place in France and Belgium. But most Nazi soldiers died in the Eastern Front.
Okay, he says Nazi soldiers. Now, were the Nazis in power? Yes. Were there fanatical leaders in the SS? Yes, there were Nazis. Nazi party-carrying card members, okay? The Wehrmacht was before, even if Hitler took over, and then even after, you had to be apolitical to be in the military, okay? Now, that does not mean that there were not Nazi sympathizers and that there were not Nazi soldiers in the Wehrmacht, okay? That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that there's a difference between the Wehrmacht and the SS. The SS are the guys that were full-on Nazis, okay? Now, I'm going to say something controversial here. Some of the SS, depends, not the German ones, okay? Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, okay, depending on them, depends, and even the Finnish ones joined the SS, because remember, the SS were volunteers, okay? But they could recruit outside of Germany, right? The Wehrmacht only took German citizens. The SS could take other countries, okay, and recruit them in. It is very different from how a usual standard military is ordered. And that's why I'm saying when he says Nazis, it's not a term that I would use for the Wehrmacht. Maybe it depends on how, because Nazism was entrenched at this point. Let's not kid ourselves, okay? But German citizens and soldiers, okay, not all of them were Nazis, okay? So.
Germany's unsuccessful invasion of the Soviet Union. The numbers are staggering. The most famous battle of the Eastern Front, and perhaps the turning point of the European war, was Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army successfully took Stalingrad, but then got surrounded by the Soviets and cut off from food and ammunition. 500,000 Nazis would ultimately die in Stalingrad.
That's, again, very generalized, but yes, it happened. He says Nazis. I don't agree with that term because that's like saying communists. That's basically like saying Germany, the Nazis and the communists killed each other. Not really what it was.
Another 100,000 were taken prisoner, of which 6,000 would ever return. POWs had a low survival rate throughout World War II, and it was particularly grim in the East.
Now, Now we have to remember that on the Eastern Front it was a war of ideologies, and it's almost a totally different war compared to the Western Front. Okay, at least in terms of POWs and how the war was generally fought. Okay, the war in the East was a war of extermination. Okay, the war in the West was quote unquote a gentleman's war. Okay, it's very different how POWs were treated on both sides, especially in the East.
When you include these POWs, roughly the same number of Germans died in Stalingrad as all the Western Front fighting against France, the UK, and the US. And though Stalingrad was a victory for the Soviets, they suffered almost twice as many losses as Germany. The Soviet Union would eventually defeat the once unstoppable German army, killing 2.3 million Nazi soldiers.
Now, 2.3 million Nazi soldiers, or German soldiers, were killed. That is astoundingly high. If I remember correctly, Germany's population today is 90-something million, or maybe 66 million, I'm not really sure. But as you can see, that's a very high percentage of your population. Now, we're not something compared to, quote-unquote, the Soviet Union. I don't know how he's going to term it, but the Soviet Union was, fun fact, not Russia, not just Russia, okay? It was a lot of other countries, okay? Ukraine was in the Soviet Union. Russia was in the Soviet Union, right? White Belarus, there was a whole bunch of other Soviet republics that were in it, okay? Even in Far East, East Turkmenistan. I'm generalizing that area, and I may be wrong there, but there's a lot of republics that are in the Soviet Union. They weren't just Russian soldiers.
But winning the war came at a cost. 8.7 million is the official tally by the Russian military, a hotly disputed number. Some studies have calculated as many as 14 million dead.
I don't do with a conservative estimate there. I would go on the higher side, especially for the Soviet Union. He says Russian, but Soviet Union, okay? Here's a general term, right? The Russians won the war by their blood, right? America won by the military capacity, right? Now, there's some truth to that, right? Not all Russians, right? But the Soviet Union paid the ultimate price for winning World War II against Germany.
To complete the count of European military deaths, we need to add German deaths from other fronts, including the North and Africa, as well as deaths from other Axis powers allied with the Nazis: Hungary, Romania, and Italy.
Now, we in American History class never talk about Hungary, Romania. We mention Italy very quickly, but Hungary and Romania were in the Axis too. I don't know where Bulgaria is, but Bulgaria was also in the Axis. I wonder how many they lost. But yeah, these casualty numbers are very minimal compared to German casualties, right? Romania, when they were threatened, swapped sides, right? Italy had a civil war happen to it, and Hungary tried to get out of the thing, but Germany occupied them. So
when you put these European military deaths on the timeline, it looks like this. You can now interact with the chart to learn more. Pause the narration if you would like more time. And now we switch to civilian deaths in Europe. Six million Jewish people were killed in the Holocaust.
He said 6 million people were killed, okay, in the Holocaust. Now, Germany suffered 8.3 million military deaths, right? Not even Jews. There were German Jews that were killed here. There was Jews from pretty much every country in Europe killed here, right?
If you separate this by country, you see that about half, 2.7 million, were Polish. 700,000 were Soviets, followed by Hungary and 17 other countries. Broken down another way, about half of the 6 million were killed in the concentration camps.
And you mentioned Poland. 2.7 million Jews were killed in Poland. Poland was absolutely decimated by World War II. Per percentage point, a best way to compare it is Serbia in World War One paid like the highest percentage of killed, of just their population just straight out killed, right? Poland is the same for World War II. Just percentage wise for their population, they were the highest, just killed, just outright. And it's absolutely devastating for both of those countries, for Serbia in World War One and for Poland in World War II.
Over 1 million died in Auschwitz. Most were killed in the gas chambers. Others died from starvation, exhaustion, disease, and other forms of execution. The second most deadly camp was Treblinka, which was exclusively an extermination camp, set up to look like a train station. Mobile killing groups killed 1.4 million Jews.
Now, the Einsatzgruppen, which is mobile killing squads, right? Mobile camps, whatever you want to call them, okay? SS, right? Some Wehrmacht units participated in this too. The Wehrmacht was not clean, like some people would say. Now, we've very much brushed over the Holocaust in United States history classes, okay? We talk about it. It's like X amount of Jews were killed. That's it, right? Gas chambers mentioned, and that's really about it. Train stations and gas stations. And gas chambers, right? There's almost no mention, usually in at least basic history classes and even advanced history classes in high school. Even in college, you have to go seek these out, right? In college, you can learn more about these, but you have to seek them out, right? But the mobile killing squads, right? This photo, I think, should be shown in at least world history class and maybe United States history class for like how we cover this, right? This is a horrific image, right? There's a soldier, right? SS, Wehrmacht, I don't know. And he's going to kill every single one of these people right here, okay? He's going to kill the men. He's going to kill the woman holding her child. And then throw them into a pit, more than likely. This is something that we have to remember happened, okay? And it is important that we remember it fully on the way it happened, right? These are an important part. It's a graphic image, but it must be remembered for what had happened, okay?
Like with the gas chambers, men were killed first to reduce the risk of revolt. The Holocaust also includes non-Jewish deaths. Between 130,000 to 500,000 Roma, then called Gypsies, were killed. The numbers are disputed. About 250,000 people with disabilities were killed. Homosexuals, Catholics, and other groups were also exterminated, but their numbers were relatively small.
Now, we never talk about the Roma or Gypsies in the United States, okay? You have to go search, again, for this, and it's at college levels, okay? Gypsies are an ethnic group. They look different from Europeans in a certain way. And even today, they are discriminated against, okay? They were also killed at very high numbers. It's not as much as the Jews, right? But it is important to remember. Homosexuals, disabled people, anything that did not serve the state, according to Germany, Nazi Germany, they were to be killed, okay? And they did so. It's important to remember all these facts.
Some historians say that other civilian deaths should go under the label of Holocaust. About 2 million non-Jewish Poles were killed under German occupation. Some of which were sent to the gas chambers at Auschwitz. When you combine civilian and military deaths, over 16% of the total Polish population died in World War II.
That's a very high percentage of your population, okay? If I remember correctly, Serbia's population, 22% of their population just outright died in World War I. 16% for Poland. You can see these numbers are extremely high. And I also would, again, as a historian, quote unquote, the Holocaust was not limited to just Jews. I do think you should include the other numbers, okay? Homosexuals, Gypsies, disabled people, all of them, should go on the Holocaust because it was an extermination against all of them. Okay, it wasn't just the Jews.
which is the highest percentage of any country. But not the highest in total death count. The Soviet Union again tops that list, losing at least as many civilians as it did soldiers, somewhere between 10 and 20 million. A particularly dark moment for the Soviet Union was the Siege of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. German forces surrounded Leningrad before civilians could be evacuated. Supplies, including food, were cut off for 2.5 years. 1.5 million people died as a result, mostly from starvation, mostly civilians. Stalin's cruelty towards his own people is partly responsible for these numbers. He often didn't allow civilians to evacuate from cities, thinking it would cause the soldiers protecting them to fight harder. About 1 million Soviets died in Stalin's own labor camps, called the Gulag.
So what he said there, he thought Stalin, the maniac that he was, okay, and I call him maniac. He's okay. He thought that the soldiers would fight less hard if the civilians weren't in the city. Now that is some bonker BS bullshit, right? Soldiers will fight to the death, right, to defend their homeland, especially if they know there's civilians behind them, right? And to evacuate them, it's kind of the whole point of you wanting to be a soldier and, defend everything behind you, right? So he was cruel to his own people in an unimaginable way. And it is true that a lot of these Soviet casualties, especially on the civilian side, could have been very, on his side, on the part that he could have done, he could have minimized these casualties, but he didn't.
Just about every country suffered civilian losses, especially countries who were invaded. While many died as a result of so-called collateral damage, the biggest numbers occurred when it was no accident.
I'll mention the quick thing on the gulags. Germany used slave labor, okay? The Soviet Union used the gulags for different purposes, okay? You died in the gulags, you died in the slave labor camps, okay? Again, he's a megalomaniac that used his own people and he killed them, and they're not even talking about before the war and the famine and everything that happens, but
Civilians were exterminated, purposely fired upon or bombed, used as human shields, or intentionally deprived of food.
that is true. Human shields were used, okay? A good movie is the actual Polish version of Warsaw, right? The Germans used human shields in front of their tanks so that the Polish soldiers wouldn't shoot them, okay? This violates pretty much everything in the damn Geneva Convention. But they didn't care, okay? Both the Soviet Union and Germany didn't care. I don't even know if they did sign, and if they signed it, they wiped their ass at the Geneva Convention, okay? Don't get me wrong. A lot of countries did that, okay? Wiped their ass with the Geneva Convention. It just depends on the situations that they were, okay?
The intentional killing of civilians was done by most warring parties, including the United Kingdom and the United States.
And we don't ever talk about that in the United States at all. We don't talk about the fact that we actually did commit war crimes. You had to go look for it. We did. Okay, we're not blameless here. We did fire on civilian purposely. Okay, we did firebombing in Japan, bombing in Germany to hit civilian targets. Right.
The United Kingdom was spared of a land invasion, but still lost 60,000 civilians, largely from German air raids or blitzes, often directed at civilian population centers. The UK did the same to German cities at a much greater magnitude, causing about 10 times the number of deaths. But most German civilian deaths came from the ground at the late stage of the war. When the Nazi regime collapsed, civilians living in occupied regions had to desperately flee from the advancing Soviet army. Rapes were widespread, and death estimates ranged from 600,000 to 3 million.
And a lot of this happened at 1944-45, okay? There's a very famous incident of a Russian sub shooting a civilian liner, okay, in the middle of the night, and 10,000 people died because the ship was overpacked, well overpacked, and they all died. Basically, the water was freezing, and then the guys for the Soviet sub got the hero of the Soviet Union, which is their highest honor. And a lot of this flight and expulsion was from Prussia, East Prussia, trying to get away from the Soviets, and the rape and all of that stuff, right? That all happened, okay? That all happened. Anything else I can say on that subject would be, at least from what I've heard, maybe what I've read, a lot of the main frontline units for the Soviet Union, again, it depends highly on the soldier and highly on that time, okay? Um, they were the ones, again, they weren't the ones that were purposely doing it. But I'm not saying they didn't. They did. But they weren't. It was the rear line guys, the rear echelon troops, okay? If you want a very breakdown of this on how this works, all you have to do is look at the US, okay? You go look at our prison camps that we did in Iraq, and you will see horrific images of what military police guys in the back of the line did to Iraqi prisoners. Okay, it usually happens in the back line instead of the very front line.
Let's step back and see where we are with the totals. We just counted about 20 million civilian deaths in Europe. If you add this to the European military deaths we already covered, it brings us to over 40 million. Then we have the Asian theater. Here we see the vast majority of military deaths in Asia came from China and Japan. On the civilian side, about 6 million deaths from China, Indonesia, Korea, Indochina, and the Philippines can be attributed to Japanese war crimes, which are sometimes compared to the Nazi atrocities due to the sheer scale of the cruelty.
And I think they should. It should very well be remembered that there's not just the Holocaust that happened against war crimes against humanity, because that's what this is. It's crimes against humanity, okay? Japanese war crimes are not as bad, and if not worse, okay? Because they can kill everyone. I'm not saying that they're like one's worse than the other. I'm just saying that they're both atrocities and that they are both war crimes that should be held to the same standard, right? Again, we don't learn any of this in American class. Literally nothing about these war crimes, and it's going to get bad as we continue here.
China had the second highest death count after the Soviet Union. And like the Soviets, the Chinese government demonstrated a stunning willingness to sacrifice its own people. Chinese nationalists opened the dike at the Yellow River, hoping the flood would halt the Japanese advance. 500,000 Chinese civilians or more were killed.
That is what I'm talking about when I say they're megalomaniacs in charge, okay? Even if it did delay them, you sacrifice 500,000 of your own people to do so, okay? That is almost unthinkable for any United States soldier to do, any NATO member, okay? Do you sacrifice 500,000 of your own people to stop the enemy? That you don't do that, but they did. And it was Chiang Kai-shek, then Mao Zedong and the communist leader, and there were other warlords. I don't exactly know how that happened for the Yellow River flood, but...
Which is 2 or 3 times the number who died in all countries in the 2004 Asian tsunamis. But the invasion of China only cost Japan 200,000 soldiers. Most were killed fighting the US and allies in the Pacific War.
Now, it only cost, what he said, 200,000, okay, in China. Now, it is important to remember that the war in China started with the Marco Polo Bridge incident, and that was in 1937, and they were fighting in China all the way up to 1945. Now, the level of fighting varied, but there were always Japanese troops in China fighting, okay, depending on the situation that was happening, whether the Chiang Kai-shek was trying to attack or not, okay? In the very late stages of World War II, Chiang Kai-shek was trying to save his resources to beat Mao Zedong. So in 44-45, they didn't want to launch major offensives because they knew a war would come with the communists. It is very surprising to me, actually, that the Japanese casualties in China are very low compared to the Pacific theater for Japan. So
a significant portion of Japanese civilian deaths were caused by American firebombing and the 2 nuclear attacks. Contrary to official U.S. statements, these airstrikes were directed at civilian populations.
That is true. Curtis LeMay directed these strikes. Okay, we intentionally targeted civilians in Japan. Okay, we thought it would lower the morale of Japan. It did not. It hardened it. Okay, strategic bombing has negligible impact on production and morale of a nation. All you need to do is put yourself in their shoes. If America is bombing you, are you mad at your government, or are you mad at the United States for bombing you? It's very simple. You're mad at the country that's bombing you, not your own country. You're getting bombed. So killing civilians intentionally is what we did.
Not military targets. When you add all the deaths outside of Europe, it brings us to a grand total of 70 million for the war, give or take depending on who's counting and what civilian deaths get included.
And that's a low estimate too. It could go up to 100, even higher than that, or at least 70 million.
More people died in World War II than in any other war in history. For comparison, here are 20 or so of the very worst wars and atrocities we have on record.
I want you to look at this. World War II was 70 million. World War I was 15. World War I was called the war to end all wars, and it didn't, right? And I want you to look at Mao and Stalin. Okay, these are after World War II, and you can see the numbers are astounding. Mao was one country, killed 40 million people. Stalin, in one country, the Soviet Union, killed 20 million of his own people. Okay, and we have all of the rest of this. Russian Civil War from 1917 until it ended, right? We have the Taiping Rebellion, British India. British India is the colonization, just all of it, I'm assuming, combined. Napoleon was 4 million death. The fall of the Ming Dynasty, 25 million, right? And then as you start getting back, it's going to start getting a lot harder. That 20 million American Indians, I'm not even sure if that's correct. That maybe that's all that died in from the United States, but we don't even know how many died when we came over here with germs. It's all died from germs, you know.
Some of these are more of atrocities than wars, but we've seen how that distinction can get blurry. Some of these spanned across centuries. World War II had the highest body count, and it all happened in just 6 years. The world's population has grown significantly since the earliest atrocities on this list.
Now, I want to look at that Mongol conquest and the Lushan revolt, okay? Both of those, they're 40 and 36 million. I guarantee you are a much higher percentage of total dead compared to World War II, because there was a lot more of us in World War II. There was not nearly as many of us back then, okay?
If you want to compare them in terms of what percentage of the world died, we can adjust the chart to look like this. This rough approximation tells us there may have been more devastating wars before World War II, proportionally speaking. When we turn to post-war conflicts, it's hard to say anything that isn't controversial. But the data shows something quite extraordinary has been happening. In 1989, John Gaddis coined the phrase the long peace to identify the absence of conflict between the nuclear powers during the Cold War. 25 years later, the Cold War is over, and the term is still being used, although its meaning may have shifted. European countries have not fought each other, except for this 10-day war in 1956 when the Soviet Union invaded Hungary.
That has changed since this video. This video came out in 2016. Russia is currently fighting Ukraine, okay? That's no longer true, so the peace has now ended. If you use the term of European countries fighting European countries, if you use world powers fighting world powers, it still technically exists. But I would call the long peace has ended at Ukraine right now. So,
when we look at European wars before World War II, it looks like this. They tend to be more frequent as you go back, though smaller in scale. And the largest 44 economies of the world have not battled each other since World War II.
I do not know where Ukraine is on there. You know what? I'm going to look it up. Okay, so just general Wikipedia knowledge. Ukraine was ranked 45th at one point. And now, currently, it is ranked 55. So he's technically correct when he says that the 44 world economies have not fought each other, depending on the time frame we're talking about here.
Rich countries have fought poorer countries, like the US versus Iraq. But rich countries have not fought other rich countries. Such a period of peace between the so-called great powers hasn't been seen since the Roman Empire. To many, peace is too strong of a word. Wars have occurred since World War II, and they can be grouped into these 4 categories. We don't see colonial wars anymore. We've already noted that interstate wars between rich countries have not occurred at all, and here we see wars involving smaller economies have tapered off. That leaves civil wars of 2 types, with and without foreign intervention. And this is what these battle deaths look like alongside of World War II. More people died fighting in World War II than in all the wars since. And again, we can't forget about world population, which has almost tripled since World War II. If we scale these numbers to show deaths in proportion to world population, showing the likelihood that a person on Earth dies in battle, the downward trend becomes even more pronounced. Now, this isn't to infer anything about why this trend is occurring. That's a discussion for another day. You can now interact with this chart to explore what conflicts are behind the totals. Now, bear in mind, we're just looking at battle deaths here, not civilian deaths, but those too are in decline. Peace is a difficult thing to measure. It's a bit like counting the people who didn't die in wars that never happened. We give such importance to the word peace, but we don't tend to notice it when it occurs.
And I very much agree with that, okay? It is so hard to keep peace around, and it is a very fragile thing that can be broken at any time, as we've seen with Ukraine and Russia currently, right? It is a fragile thing that must be kept, right? Because wars like this would be absolutely devastating to the world population today.
Or report on it. Sometimes it takes reminding ourselves of how terrible war once was to see the peace that has been growing around us. Of course, this trend may not continue, and it's not clear how looking at these charts can help us make the right decisions to ensure that it does. But the longer the long peace grows, the more significant it becomes. So if watching the news doesn't make us feel hopeful about where things are heading, watching the numbers might.
All right, so I'm going to wrap the video up there. It's a very interesting video, and I think it is important for people to watch, right? I leave the description, and in the description is the video link. Go check them out. If you guys like this type of content, leave a comment down there. Tell me what I should react to. Usually anything military, I can, mingle around and probably try to get some of the stuff right, or at least add to it in a variety of ways, okay? Yeah, very important video. Like the video if you like it, subscribe, and then go check out his channel. Links in the description. Otherwise, I'll see people later.